Now that the Nintendo Switch has been on the market for almost 4 years, I think it is a good time to evaluate its quality compared to other Nintendo consoles. As you can guess by the title of this video, I am not as fond of this console as I was hoping to be. The Switch is a fine machine. I don't think Nintendo has ever truly had a bad system. When it comes to the hardware, Nintendo did not skimp on the performance. It may not seem like much compared to the PS4 or Xbox One, but the Tegra X1 is an impressive chipset, and it is the most powerful one that they could have used when the Switch was being conceptualized. The Joy-Cons, when they work, are an interesting piece of technology, and the HD Rumble does improve the feel of certain games. The hybrid concept allows for the full breadth of Nintendo's library to be available on one device. It is also receiving an unprecedented amount of third-party support, where there are plenty of interesting ideas coming from indie developers and Western third-party games that nobody thought would ever come to this console. There is certainly a lot to like out of this machine, and its quality really depends on how much it appeals to your tastes and whether or not you owned a Wii U. I am not trying to downplay the quality of the Switch. However, despite these benefits, I cannot help but feel disappointed with it. The Switch may not be a bad console, but I don't think its first-party offerings have been the same quality that we saw out of the Wii U and the 3DS era. I suppose a good place to start is with Nintendo's legacy. Nintendo has fostered a massive library of iconic franchises. Platformers like Super Mario and Donkey Kong, adventure games like Metroid and Zelda, strategy games like Fire Emblem and Advance Wars, RPGs like Xenoblade and Earthbound, racing games like F-Zero and Mario Kart. When combining the full breadth of Nintendo's history, there is truly something for everyone. For me specifically, they have created some of my favorite games of all time. Unfortunately, Nintendo has been mishandling their legacy in the most ridiculous of ways. I can understand the removal of Virtual Console. I know that a lot of fans liked it, but it led to a lot of indie and third-party developers having to compete with Nintendo's iconic classics. I don't think it is unreasonable to assume that there are people who are more content with rebuying and replaying their original library than trying out something new that resembles the classics that they enjoyed during their childhood. Bundling the Nintendo Switch Online with the Legacy Collection does make sense, and it adds value to the service. I would rather have a subscription for the full library instead of them being served a la carte like we saw with the past 2 generations. Unfortunately, 4 years later, this console actually offers less in terms of legacy content than the Wii U did in the same time span. After 4 years, the Wii U Virtual Console had games from the NES, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, Game Boy Advance, DS, and Wii catalog. The Nintendo Switch Online service only has the NES and Super Nintendo collection. There are also several games that released on the Wii U that cannot be played through this service. Earthbound and Super Mario RPG have not been re-released on the Nintendo Switch in any form, despite also being available on the Wii U and Super Nintendo Classic. Adding more games only adds value to the online service, so it is annoying having a slow drip feed of titles just to get the same library that we saw last generation on the Wii U. The choices for people who don't own a Wii U to get these games are to either be patient for an unknown amount of time or to seek alternative means just to play them. There are other classic games released as anniversary celebrations, but they come with their own problems as well. Super Mario 3D All-Stars was a fairly controversial release last year. It is a collection of 3 really good Mario games, but that's about it. The presentation of the collection itself leaves more to be desired. There aren't any cool bits of information, such as commercials for the games, artwork, beta content, or anything that would make it more worth playing if you don't already own them. It's just a trilogy of games, which isn't bad on its own right, but these kinds of things would have made a better collection. It simply would have been nice if there was more to it, like we have seen in other collections. What really irritates people about this is the artificial demand that is being created by it being a limited release. Nintendo will be pulling this game from their digital storefront, and they will stop production of this game at the end of March. After that, you have to rely on getting the physical version secondhand to play these games. After a lot of vocal fans spoke out against this decision, Nintendo announced another game game that will have the same issue. The original Fire Emblem received an official localization that launched on December 4th. This is also a limited edition release of the game, and I find this to be even worse than Mario 3D All-Stars. First of all, there is no physical version of this game, so there is no way of getting it secondhand if you are too late to buy it. Second of all, this is technically still playable on the Famicom Collection that comes with Nintendo Switch Online. The implication here is that by removing this game from their store, Nintendo is punishing people for not speaking Japanese. This isn't a limited edition re-release of a game. It is a limited edition localization that you will no longer be able to play comfortably in a language that you can speak because of Nintendo's absurd idea that this should be a limited release. There is just something scummy about pulling a localization from a digital storefront and only allowing Japanese speakers to play a game comfortably. Meanwhile, on the Wii U, this wasn't an issue. If I still wanted to play Earthbound Beginnings, which is an official localization of the original Earthbound, it is still available years after it originally released. Unless Nintendo closes the eShop, it will still be purchasable. The same applies for many other legacy titles that can still be purchased on the Wii U. By my understanding, Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze is the only game that Nintendo decided to pull from the library. Outside of the price model, the Wii U did a much better job at creating a valuable service that doesn't mistreat Nintendo's legacy. There were numerous titles across many different platforms available for purchase on the Wii U without the absurdity of a limited release window for a digital game. It is disappointing seeing that the Switch is inferior to the Wii U when it comes to allowing people to play Nintendo's games. The second main complaint I have is with the new first-party offerings that the Switch has been getting. I buy Nintendo consoles to play Nintendo games. When the Switch was first announced as a hybrid that will receive the full breadth of Nintendo's library, I was excited to have the chance to play all of the handheld franchises that I missed out on. There wasn't anything like Fire Emblem, Pokemon, Animal Crossing, Mario and Luigi, or Kirby on the Wii U unless it was either a weird spin-off or a virtual console game. The Switch was an opportunity to actually get to play these different franchises. Unfortunately, it didn't really pan out as well as I was hoping. Fire Emblem Three Houses turned out to be a thoroughly unenjoyable experience. I cannot enjoy the story on any level. I legitimately hate Byleth as a character. They seem so distant from the actual story that I probably would have liked the game more without them. For example, Geralt tells Byleth to watch out for Lady Rhea, but Byleth doesn't even try to find out why Geralt doesn't trust them. They see that Lady Rhea looks like Lady Saros, but the game doesn't even acknowledge it until the end of the Golden Deer route, almost like it is irrelevant to the rest of the story. They see that Sothis is floating in their head, and they don't at all consider the implications of God living in their head. They fuse with Sothis, essentially becoming God themselves, and they never even consider the implications of that, and Sothis is never brought up again. Almost like that whole ordeal is irrelevant to the rest of the story.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
This entire story just doesn't go anywhere, and it never felt like anything important was actually happening. Byleth especially isn't a character with thoughts, emotions, and motivations. The writers just wanted people to relate to them, so they made a silent, stoic husk of a character for players to immerse themselves onto, but they didn't want to give them any humanizing character traits, which is the opposite of how you go about creating a relatable character. The story in Three Houses just feels unaccomplished. Nothing happens until the time skip because the protagonist doesn't really do anything. Objectively speaking, the worst thing a character can do for a story is nothing. The gameplay isn't any better either. The dialogue system is functionally useless, and it only makes a downgrade from the spoken protagonist seen in other games all the more obvious. I simply cannot wrap my mind around why anyone thought it was a good idea to hire Yusuke Kobayashi to play a silent protagonist. The monastery is just a a bunch of tedious chores, and being optional is not an excuse for the exploration to be worse than the My Castle system in Fates or the exploration in Shadows of Valentia. The maps were not interesting enough to be reused 3 times. Three Houses was perhaps the worst introduction to the series that I could have had. No other game has the issues that this one does. If you want a good strategy game on the Switch, I recommend checking out King's Bounty 2 or Project Triangle Strategy. It seems that they are going to have much more meaningful experiences than Three Houses ever did. Pokemon Sword and Shield is a fine game on its own right, but there are things that it could have done better. From a presentation standpoint, the environments look kind of ugly, and there is no voice acting. From a gameplay standpoint, it is a fairly linear experience of training Pokemon, going to gyms, and getting gym badges. This isn't inherently wrong, but I feel like if a game's not doing much with the story, there's no point in keeping it linear. I would have rather the open area be a hub that I can explore, and I find different gyms along the adventure that I can complete in any order, and the difficulty of the gyms are scaled depending on the order that they're encountered in. I feel like that would have made for a much more compelling game. Unfortunately, it's not the one that we got. I honestly don't mind the removal of the national decks. I feel like a new game should focus on the new content that it has to offer, but this game just isn't doing much in general. It's a fine experience as a first Pokemon game. I simply don't think it lives up to the DS era games such as Black and White, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, or Pokemon Platinum. There are much more fulfilling experiences that you can have with the series. Animal Crossing New Horizons has a good game in there, somewhere. I like the terraforming system. It is cool being able to mold the island however the player sees fit, and they can see a village grow as new villagers move to the island. Unfortunately, this game is just very tedious. It seems like every action takes more text boxes than it honestly should. This game loves to remind the player how the museum works if they go to Blathers without anything to donate. Gulliver constantly reminds the player how the communicator is supposed to work when they already know what that activity entails. Every item that is collected shows the item and description, which is usually just a bad pun. The crafting system can only make one item at a time, so if you need a lot of the same thing, it can be annoying watching the same animation a dozen times just to get everything. I hope Nintendo eventually patches this game to add quality of life options and improve the flow of the gameplay. Right now, it feels like everything I could want to do is blocked by a weird obstacle that does not need to be there. I know that this game is for younger audiences, but I can't even imagine children like having to reread the same terrible sea bass pun 50 times when trying to catch a shark. Unfortunately, I don't think Nintendo has any intention on improving the flow of this game. The last Nintendo Direct discussed an update for Animal Crossing that was about the Super Mario items coming to the game, and they have yet to announce anything regarding quality of life improvements. The game is probably just going to remain as tedious as it is now. There is also an obnoxious design choice where there is only one island per Switch. It actually makes the game worse for people who share a console because a lot of your decisions are going to be dictated by whatever player 1 wanted to do. You literally don't get to experience the point of the game if you are the second player. It is a very baffling design philosophy. There are better games on the Switch for building and growing a town, such as Dragon Quest Builders, if you aren't patient enough for Animal Crossing. Alpha Dream, to much dismay, was shut down on October 1st after declaring bankruptcy. Unless Nintendo contracts a different studio or develops one internally, we may not even see a Mario and Luigi game this generation. There are certainly studios who can tackle it. A lot of people liked what Next Level Games has done with Luigi's Mansion, so it would be cool to give them full reign on a different kind of Mario game. However, this franchise is essentially in purgatory until Nintendo figures out what they want to do with it. Kirby Star Allies is also just okay. It is a little short, having only 4 worlds while Planet Robobot had a whopping 7 worlds. I don't think I'm alone on thinking that this game could have used more content. I personally also don't really like the Allies gimmick. It seems like it would be more fun as a multiplayer game than a single player game, which is unfortunate for me who just prefers playing games single multiplayer. It's a fine game on its own right, but I feel like I would have more fun playing the 3DS games. The recurring theme here is that the 3DS sequels I was looking forward to are inferior to other third-party games and other games in their respective franchises. It gives the impression that I would have had more fun if I just bought a 3DS and played Fire Emblem, Animal Crossing, Kirby, Mario & Luigi, and the DS-era Pokemon games on that console instead of waiting for the Switch iterations of them. As for the Wii U sequels, a lot of my favorite Wii U games were ported to the Switch without many enhancements. Mario Kart 8, Pikmin 3, Donkey Kong, Tropical Freeze, Captain Toad, and Super Mario 3D World were some of my favorite Wii U games. Over 6 years later, the successor to the Wii U doesn't have proper sequels to any of these games. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is still largely the same game I have played on the Wii U, with the addition of Battle Mode, which I never really played in the first place. It's a good game, the enhancements just don't compel me to actually buy it for the price that it's at. Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze doesn't have any meaningful new content. It's a good game, but it's still largely the same as what I played on the Wii U. It is also a little weird seeing that Retro Studios released Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze in 2014, and 4 years later they released the same game again with no sign of what they were working on in the 4 years between these games releasing. I hope that whatever they were doing hasn't been cancelled and we get to see whatever it was. However, they are now working on Metroid Prime 4, so I'm not sure if that project will ever surface. Captain Toad and Super Mario 3D World have extra content, but there is no way to purchase the extra content separately. It's $60 for what is largely the same experience and a few hours of something new, when I would much rather just be able to jump into the new content for a cheaper price. Pikmin 3 Deluxe made the controller mapping worse, since switching captains, dismissing Pikmin, and using Spicy Spray require holding down Y and pressing direction on the thumbstick. It is less intuitive than any other Pikmin game to perform these basic actions, and the game doesn't do much more than offer a couple of new challenges. We may eventually get proper sequels to these games. In the last Nintendo Direct, they did announce Splatoon 3, even though the Switch already has a new Splatoon. But at the same time, if the next mainline Mario Kart game or other sequels to these games were supposed to release this year, I don't see the point of announcing Splatoon 3 now. They could have just waited until whatever this year's bigger games have finally released. That is not to say that Splatoon 3 isn't a big game, I just don't see the point of teasing something that will release in 2022 when we still have 2021 to get through. That is not to say that there isn't any meaningful new content on the Switch. Super Mario Odyssey, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, ARMS, Torn of the Golden Country, Astral Chain, and Luigi's Mansion 3 are fantastic experiences exclusive to the Switch. I really do like Witcher 3, Skyrim, Dragon Quest Builders, Untitled Goose Game, Ys 8, and plenty of other games that I've bought for the Switch. However, I buy Nintendo consoles to play Nintendo's games. When third-party developers are carrying the system, while Nintendo isn't delivering the same quality that I'm used to from other generations, then the console just feels more mediocre in comparison to its predecessors. The new games outside the ones I listed tend to be mixed bags. I am no longer having fun playing Smash, and I honestly like the online play in Smash 4 and ARMS more than in this game, because Smash 4 offered 4 fun and 4 glory modes, and ARMS has this really fun arena that keeps shaking things up and giving different game modes to play, so it's not all just one-on-one fighting. Super Mario Maker 2 has some good ideas and weird missed opportunities. I like that they added story mode to explore different ideas of what the game can do. I don't like that they didn't improve the editor at all in a game about making Mario levels. Link's Awakening is okay. It added some quality of life improvements that makes the game easier to play than the original versions. At the same time, it's just Link's Awakening. The dungeon builder seemed like a cool idea, but unless a game is built around the idea, I don't think it was ever going to live up to people's expectations. Paper Mario and the Origami King may be fine on its own right, I just don't like how the series wants to take baby steps closer to the roots of the series, but it doesn't want to embrace the parts that make it an RPG. Picking and choosing what routes you want to be a part of feels backwards to me. I would rather them just make it like the original 2 games or do their own thing like Super Paper Mario instead of trying to take half steps in some directions while also having weird intrusive gimmicks. It honestly seems like a lot of what the Switch has to offer are the kinds of games I have already played on the Wii U, or inferior experiences to what I can get on the 3DS. I understand that the pandemic has drastically altered how Nintendo has to go about developing games. Until their employees are vaccinated, it is dangerous to have them congregate in the same building. Development operations may not return to normal until sometime next year. The Wii U and 3DS never had to deal with these kinds of circumstances, and hopefully Nintendo will never have to deal with these conditions again. However, it is important to keep in mind that my complaints aren't about the quantity of these new games, whereas the quality of these games. Most of the ones I have issues with released before the pandemic began. There are other complaints that I have with the Switch. For example, there are no customization options such as themes or any way of organizing the home menu outside of the preset filters. There is also no way of pinning digital games to the home menu for quick access. A console does not necessarily need these features, but it would be nice. It would simply make each console feel more personal, so it's not just a Nintendo Switch, it's your Nintendo Switch, if that makes sense. Right now, the Switch doesn't offer anything like that. The console also doesn't have any messaging features to make it easier to communicate with friends. I personally wouldn't use that feature myself, but I can see why it bothers people for not having it. The Nintendo Switch is just a console. It turns on and it plays games, which is the minimum that a console should do. I am only complaining about this because the 3DS had themes and organization features, while the Wii U had a whole slew of different features such as an internet browser, Miiverse, and streaming service to make it more than just a console. The coolest aspect of the hardware is the Joy-Con controllers, which has an obnoxious drifting issue. I feel bad for anyone getting the special Zelda-themed Joy-Cons because they will probably start facing issues within a matter of months. Meanwhile, my golden Skyward Sword Wii remote is still fully functional after a decade. Nintendo, unfortunately, doesn't seem to be taking this issue seriously because different departments have different stances on it. Maybe if the Joy-Cons were bigger, they could have used the Switch Pro controller thumbsticks instead of using the ones that are prone to breaking so easily, and perhaps that is the solution that they go with for a Switch revision. As much as people like to complain about the Wii U gamepad, at least it worked for the entire lifespan of the Wii U. That is more that I can say about the Switch Joy-Cons. I imagine that the Switch will get better over time. Unfortunately, after having this console for 4 years, I'm becoming doubtful that its biggest issues will ever be addressed. They had all this time to tell their audience that they are committed to improving the legacy selection of this console, but they haven't done anything to add support for new consoles or to do more than the drip feed that we have been seeing for the past few years. They saw the backlash from the limited edition digital games, and they are just being stubborn about this absurd decision that has no reason to happen other than Nintendo wants it to be a limited edition release. With the success of Fire Emblem Three Houses, I wouldn't be surprised if the next Fire Emblem shares the same kinds of issues that game did. With how well Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is selling, Nintendo could just end up riding out this whole generation on that game and wait until the next Switch to launch Mario Kart 9, perhaps as a multi-generational title. Metroid Prime 4 had to be rebooted after being in development for several years, so it's going to be a while before we get to see whatever Retro Studios is brewing. Perhaps we will see it next year, but I'm not entirely sure when it will be ready. A lot of people really do like the Nintendo Switch. It does have quite a bit going for it, especially for the many people who didn't own a Wii U. The portability aspect is really cool, even if your mileage with it may vary. There are plenty of interesting games that may appeal to you depending on your tastes. I personally would rather buy my third-party games on Xbox, but there is still merit to getting some of them on the Switch. Unfortunately, as somebody who already owned a Wii U and doesn't benefit from the portability factor, I don't get as much enjoyment out of it as I would have otherwise. I still like Nintendo overall, but I'm not so fond of the Switch itself. When all a new console does is remind me of how much I would rather play the Wii U or 3DS, then I think it is fair to say that the Switch is a disappointment.
Disappointed!
The Switch is unfortunately Nintendo's most just okay console when it could have been so much more than that.
If it's not fun, why bother?